Ethan adjusted his tie, his pulse steady despite the storm raging inside him. Tonight was the night. After 7 years of sacrifice, of sweat, exhaustion, and blind devotion, Rachel would finally see everything he had built for her. He had envisioned this moment 1,000 times, the stunned gratitude in her eyes, the tearful embrace, the whispered "I love you" that had been missing for months. But when she sat across from him at the candlelit restaurant, dressed in a designer gown he hadn't bought, checking her phone with barely a glance his way, Ethan knew something was off. Then, before he could even speak, Rachel sighed, set her napkin down, and said 6 words that shattered his world. "Ethan, I think we should talk." The weight of those words, the coldness in her tone, the lack of hesitation in her gaze, it hit him harder than years of grueling labor ever had. She leaned forward, voice soft but firm. "I've changed. I want more. I can't be with someone who doesn't match my future." The engagement ring in Ethan's pocket felt like a cruel joke. The hospital deed, still tucked into his jacket, suddenly meant nothing. She had no idea what he had done for her, no idea what she had just thrown away. But she was about to find out. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Ethan Carter, 34 years old, had spent the last 7 years of his life pushing his body past exhaustion, juggling 2 grueling jobs to support his wife, Rachel. By day, he worked under the blistering Texas sun, hauling bricks and pouring concrete at a construction site. By night, he traded his hard hat for a security uniform, patrolling the empty halls of a downtown Houston hotel, fighting against the overwhelming fatigue that threatened to consume him. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, and comfort was a distant memory. His hands were rough, his back ached constantly, and his bank account was always dangerously close to empty, but none of that mattered to him. His dream wasn't wealth or luxury. It was simple. He wanted a stable home, a loving wife, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his sacrifices meant something. He had believed with everything in him that Rachel was his future. Their apartment was barely livable, a cramped, aging space with peeling paint, unreliable plumbing, and a window that overlooked a filthy alleyway. But Ethan never cared about any of that. He only cared that Rachel was there, curled up on their tiny couch with her medical textbooks, her dreams so big they barely fit within the walls of their home. Rachel had always wanted to be a doctor. It wasn't just a goal, it was her identity. From the moment they met, she had talked about saving lives, about making a difference, about climbing higher than anyone expected her to, and Ethan had been in awe of her passion, her relentless determination. He never once questioned putting her dream before his own. If she needed textbooks, he worked an extra shift. If tuition was due, he skipped meals and stretched every dollar. If she was stressed from exams, he swallowed his exhaustion and stayed up to cook her favorite meals, massaging her shoulders while she memorized endless medical terms. He gave up hobbies, let friendships fade, ignored his own ambitions. All so she could succeed. He convinced himself that it was temporary, that one day all of it would pay off, that they were building a life together. Every sacrifice he made, every hour of back-breaking labor was for their shared future. At least, that's what he thought. Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his coffee as he watched Ethan rub his tired eyes. "Man, I'm just saying, not every woman remembers who stood by them during the struggle," he said, his voice calm but edged with something close to concern. Ethan snorted, shaking his head. "You don't know Rachel. She's not like that." Derek sighed, setting his cup down with a soft clink. "I hope you're right. Just don't be blind, all right?" Ethan chuckled, waving him off. But something about the way Derek looked at him lingered in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. Nights blurred into each other, one exhausting shift bleeding into the next. Ethan would come home at dawn, his body aching, his feet dragging, only to find Rachel already curled up in bed, her textbooks spread around her like a protective barrier. Sometimes she'd stir, murmur something unintelligible before turning away, too deep in her studies or her dreams to notice the man who had given up everything for her. He never woke her. Instead, he'd drop his work boots by the door, careful not to make a sound, and collapse onto their sagging couch, too tired to even change out of his uniform. The walls of their apartment were thin, and he could hear their neighbors arguing, their voices sharp and tired, just like he felt. The leaky faucet in their kitchen dripped incessantly, a quiet reminder of all the things they couldn't afford to fix. Their fridge was never full, their cabinets barely stocked, but it didn't matter. Rachel needed tuition, books, supplies, everything else was secondary. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep took him, he'd stare at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing, and remind himself that this was temporary, that the long shifts, the hunger, the exhaustion, it would all be worth it. "I'll rest when you're a doctor," he whispered once, more to himself than to her. But Rachel never heard him. She never saw the bruises on his hands from lifting crates at the warehouse, never noticed the way he winced when he bent down to untie his boots. She never asked if he was okay, and Ethan, blinded by love, never thought to wonder why. Ethan first noticed it in the little things. Rachel used to whisper "I love you" every morning before he left for work, even if she was half asleep, her voice groggy but warm. But then, one day she didn't say it. He thought maybe she was just tired. Then the next day, and the next. It became a pattern, an absence so subtle yet so loud it made his chest tighten. He started testing it, kissing her forehead before heading out and murmuring "I love you," waiting for her to say it back. At first, she just nodded. Then she stopped acknowledging it altogether. She became distant, distracted. When Ethan suggested a rare night out together, just dinner at their usual cheap diner, she barely looked up from her laptop. "I have to study," she mumbled. He tried again a week later, asking if she wanted to go to the park where they used to walk and talk for hours. "I can't, too much going on." There was always an excuse, always something more important than him. She didn't reach for his hand when they sat on the couch, didn't laugh at his jokes like she used to. And then there were the clothes. Rachel had always been practical. Scrubs, old jeans, t-shirts she stole from Ethan's drawer. But suddenly, new outfits started appearing in their tiny closet. Dresses, heels, designer brands he knew they couldn't afford. When he asked about them, she shrugged. "A friend gave them to me." She never said who. The first time, Ethan let it slide. The second time, it gnawed at him. By the third, he forced himself to swallow the unease and trust her. Because that's what love was, right, trust? Then she started staying out late. It was gradual at first, an extra hour at the library, a late-night study session with classmates. But soon it was every night. "I have to stay at the hospital," she said one evening, stuffing her notes into her bag in a rush. "Extra rounds, you know how it is." Ethan nodded, even though he didn't. What he did know was that she barely looked him in the eye when she said it. One night, as she sat on the couch texting furiously, Ethan caught a glimpse of her phone screen over her shoulder, a name he didn't recognize. A conversation thread filled with messages she quickly swiped away. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a classmate, maybe a group project, maybe... Self-doubt crept in, poisoning his thoughts. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that Rachel was just stressed, that medical school was overwhelming her, that he was imagining things. He thought about asking her, but what would he even say? "Hey, are you cheating on me?" He shook his head. No. Rachel loved him. She wouldn't do that, would she? Derek leaned against the bar, swirling the ice in his glass before shooting Ethan a look that was somewhere between frustration and pity. "Bro, you're funding her dream, but are you still part of it?" His words cut through the noise of the crowded room, but Ethan just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Not this again," he muttered. "Yeah, this again," Derek shot back. "You barely see her. She's always too busy. And don't even try to tell me you don't feel it." Ethan exhaled, gripping his beer a little tighter. "She's stressed, man. Medical school isn't easy. She's working hard." "And so are you," Derek interrupted, his voice sharp. "You're working yourself to death for her. But tell me this, when was the last time she made time for you?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came. He thought about it, really thought about it. It had been months since they'd spent a full day together, since they'd just talked without her glancing at her phone or rushing off somewhere. The realization sat heavy in his stomach. Derek watched his expression shift and sighed. "Look, man, I'm not saying she's cheating. I'm saying people change when they get what they want. I just don't want you to be the guy who gave up everything for someone who was just passing through." Ethan forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't know her like I do." Derek let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "No, I don't, but I know you, and I know when a man is holding on to something that's already slipping away." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell Derek he was wrong, But for the first time, a small, unwelcome voice in the back of his mind whispered a question he couldn't ignore. What if he's right? Ethan was just getting off a long shift at the construction site when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He barely had the energy to answer, but something about the unknown number made him pick up. Ethan Carter? The voice on the other end was professional, clipped. This is William Mathers, an attorney handling the estate of your late uncle, Richard Carter. Ethan frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. I think you've got the wrong guy, he said. I didn't have an Uncle Richard. You did, the lawyer replied, and he left you a significant inheritance. I'd like to schedule a meeting to go over the details. Ethan almost laughed. Yeah, right, he said, glancing around the break room, half expecting his coworkers to jump out and tell him it was some elaborate prank. How much are we talking? Approximately $12 million. The words sent a shock through him, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. What? He breathed. Mr. Carter, your uncle had no immediate family left, and for reasons outlined in his will, he chose you as his beneficiary. The money is yours, no strings attached. Ethan barely remembered the rest of the conversation. He met with the lawyer the next day, signed some paperwork, and just like that, his life had changed. $12 million, enough to walk away from his jobs, enough to never struggle again. But instead of celebrating, Ethan felt something else, a strange, creeping doubt. He didn't tell Rachel, not yet. He wanted to see something first. Would she still love him if she thought he was just a struggling construction worker? Or was Derek right all along? The more Ethan thought about it, the more he knew exactly what he wanted to do with the money. Rachel had sacrificed so much to become a doctor, worked so hard. She always talked about how she wanted to help people, how she wanted to make a difference. And now, he had the power to make that dream come true. He spent weeks working with lawyers and financial advisors, securing the purchase of a small but well-equipped private hospital in Houston. Not just any hospital, one that would have the best equipment, the best staff, the best future. And when everything was finalized, he put it in Rachel's name. He imagined the look on her face when he told her, the shock, the gratitude, the tears of joy as she realized what he had done for her. He pictured her throwing her arms around him, whispering, I love you, Ethan. I can't believe you did this. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. She would finally see, she would finally understand how much he loved her, how much he believed in her. This was their future, their fresh start, and on the night of her graduation, he would give it to her. The ultimate gift, the ultimate proof of his devotion. Nothing could go wrong, at least. That's what he told himself. Ethan sat on the edge of their worn-out couch, his work boots still on, laces undone, watching Rachel from across the room. She hadn't noticed him yet, too busy staring at her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen with an urgency that made his stomach twist. She was smiling, the kind of smile he hadn't seen in a long time, soft and unguarded. Not the distracted nod she gave him when he kissed her goodbye in the mornings. Not the polite, tight-lipped expression she wore when he asked if she wanted to grab dinner. This was different. This was effortless. He shifted slightly, waiting to see if she would glance up, acknowledge his presence, say something, anything. She didn't. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh, biting her lip before typing another message. Ethan clenched his jaw. He told himself it was nothing, that he was being ridiculous, that he was exhausted and reading too much into it. But the longer he watched, the harder it became to ignore the nagging feeling creeping up his spine. Rachel used to be an open book. She'd always left her phone on the table, never guarded it like a secret. Now, it was always in her hand or face down on the counter, locked away behind passwords he didn't know. He couldn't remember the last time she'd let him hold it to look something up. And it wasn't just the phone. It was the way she carried herself, lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. But Ethan still felt the full burden of their life, their struggle, their sacrifices. It made him wonder, was I the weight she shed? His mind wandered back to the nights he spent breaking his body for their future. The times he skipped meals to pay for her textbooks. The mornings he left while she was still asleep, whispering, I love you to someone who never said it back anymore. The hospital he had just bought in her name, the future he was building for her, for them. But for the first time, he wasn't so sure it was for them at all. Ethan swallowed the lump forming in his throat, forcing himself to look away. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe she was already gone and he was the only one who hadn't realized it yet. Ethan spent weeks planning the perfect night. He booked a table at a high-end restaurant somewhere they had never been able to afford before. He wanted everything to be perfect, down to the last detail. A candlelit table by the window, expensive wine, a night where for once they wouldn't have to think about bills or stress. Tonight wasn't about struggle. Tonight was about the future. He had the engagement ring in his pocket, a simple yet elegant diamond set in a band he had chosen with care. And in his jacket, tucked safely inside an envelope, were the hospital ownership papers, the proof of everything he had worked for, everything he was giving to her. He imagined her reaction, tears of joy, disbelief, maybe even an apology for how distant she had been lately. This was going to be the night that changed everything. Rachel arrived late, looking effortlessly stunning in a dress he had never seen before, one of those expensive ones she had brushed off as a friend's gift. Ethan ignored the small sting of that realization. Tonight wasn't about doubts. He stood as she approached the table, pulling out her chair, but when she sat, she barely met his eyes. She seemed distracted, almost impatient. He pushed past it, determined to make the night special. "You look beautiful," he said. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give a stranger in passing. Polite, distant. The waiter poured the wine, and Ethan took a deep breath, reaching for her hand across the table. "Rachel, I wanted tonight to be special," he started, but before he could continue, she pulled her hand away and sighed. "Ethan, we need to talk." Something in her tone made his stomach drop. He had imagined many things happening tonight, but not this. "Okay," he said cautiously, sitting back. Rachel exhaled as if she had been carrying something heavy for too long. "I can't be with someone like you anymore." The world around him blurred, the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, the distant sound of laughter, it all faded into nothing. "What?" His voice barely came out. She straightened as if she had rehearsed this. "I've worked too hard to be stuck in this life. I need someone who matches my status, someone who fits where I'm going." Ethan blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared for every scenario tonight except this. "Rachel, are you serious?" She nodded, unapologetic. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I need more." More. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. More than the years he had sacrificed, more than the sleepless nights, the missed meals, the broken body he had pushed past exhaustion so she could chase her dream. He swallowed, his fingers tightening around the velvet box in his pocket. She had no idea what he had planned for her tonight. And now, she never would. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the woman he had built his entire world around, trying to process the words that had just come out of her mouth. "I need someone who matches my status." The sentence echoed in his head, hollow and cruel, unraveling everything he had believed about their future. His fingers twitched against the small velvet box in his pocket, the weight of the engagement ring suddenly unbearable. He had spent months choosing the perfect one, picturing the moment he would slide it onto her finger, watching her eyes light up with love and gratitude. Now, it was nothing more than a painful reminder of how blind he had been. Rachel didn't look sad. She didn't look guilty. She just looked done, as if she had already moved past him, past this life they had built together, past the man who had spent years breaking himself so she could stand where she was now. His jaw clenched as he reached into his jacket, not for the ring, but for the envelope that held something far bigger, something that should have secured their future. He had put her name on the hospital, thinking it would be a symbol of everything they had endured, a reward for all their sacrifices. Our sacrifices, he had told himself. But now, staring at the woman across from him, he realized the truth. The sacrifices had never been ours. They had been his. A bitter laugh bubbled in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wanted to throw the envelope onto the table, shove it in her face, tell her what a fool she was for walking away from a life that was already set up for her. But what was the point? She didn't care. She had already made her decision. The hospital he had bought in her name, the ring meant to bind them together. She would never see either. She had thrown them away before she even knew they existed. Rachel sighed, glancing around as if hoping to wrap this up quickly, to move on with her life. "I just don't think we want the same things anymore," she said, her tone almost casual. Ethan's hands curled into fists under the table, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream at her, ask her, "How dare you?" But instead, he did the only thing that still gave him control. He let go. He inhaled deeply, then slowly, deliberately, pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't even look at her. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a woman who had never really been his to begin with. Ethan walked out of the restaurant without looking back, his body moving on autopilot while his mind spiraled through the wreckage of what had just happened. The night that was supposed to define their future had instead shattered everything he had built, leaving nothing but silence and an empty ring box pressing against his leg. He barely noticed the people around him, the couples laughing over candlelit dinners, the soft hum of music drifting from inside. It all felt distant, like another world, one he no longer belonged to. His hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the unopened text thread with Rachel. Less than an hour ago, he had been rehearsing what to say, picturing the way her face would light up when he told her about the hospital, about their future. Now, the only thing he saw was the cold finality in her eyes when she told him, "I need someone who matches my status." He exhaled shakily, forcing himself to move. Standing still felt unbearable, like the weight of what had happened would crush him if he didn't keep walking. He didn't go home. The thought of stepping into their apartment, his apartment now, felt suffocating. Instead, he found himself at Derek's place, knocking harder than necessary. When the door swung open, Derek took one look at him and his expression shifted from confusion to something more serious. "Tell me she didn't," he muttered, stepping aside to let Ethan in. Ethan didn't answer. He just walked past Derek and sank onto the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. He felt raw, stripped down to nothing. "She ended it," he finally said, his voice hollow. Derek sat across from him, leaning forward. "How?" Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "Over dinner, like she was telling me she didn't like the wine." He shook his head, staring down at his hands. "Said she needed someone who matched her status, like I was a stepping stone she'd finally outgrown." Derek swore under his breath. "Damn. I tried to warn you, man." "I know," Ethan admitted, and for the first time he really did. All the red flags, all the signs, he had ignored them, convinced himself that love was enough, that they were enough. But love had never been the problem. Rachel had never planned to stay. He had just been too blind to see it. Derek studied him for a long moment before reaching into the mini fridge and tossing him a beer. "So what now?" Ethan caught the can, staring at it for a second before shaking his head. "I don't know." But as the words left his mouth, something inside him shifted. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. Rachel had walked away believing she had won, believing he was just another man left in the past. She had no idea what was coming. Ethan sat in Derek's apartment long after the conversation had faded, staring at the unopened beer in his hands. The words kept replaying in his mind like a cruel joke. "I need someone who matches my status." It wasn't just rejection, it was dismissal, a final confirmation that he had never truly been part of the future he had sacrificed everything for. The woman he had loved, the woman he had bled for, had never planned to stay. He had been nothing more than a means to an end. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small velvet box that suddenly felt heavier than it had hours ago. He flipped it open, staring at the ring. A perfect diamond, carefully chosen, meant to symbolize a love that had never been real. With a slow exhale, he snapped the box shut and tossed it onto the coffee table like it was worthless. Because now, it was. But the ring wasn't the worst of it. The real punch to the gut was the hospital, ownership papers still folded neatly inside his jacket. He had spent weeks planning it, making sure everything was perfect, ready to give Rachel something that most people could only dream of, and she had walked away before she even knew it existed. She had thrown away a future that was already waiting for her. Derek watched him carefully, the weight of silence thick between them. "You're thinking about telling her, aren't you?" he finally said. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "What would be the point?" He leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "She doesn't deserve it. She doesn't deserve any of it." Derek nodded, cracking open his beer. "Damn right she doesn't." He took a sip, then smirked. "So what are you gonna do with the whole damn hospital?" Ethan let out a humorless laugh, but there was something dark beneath it. "Keep it." Derek raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" Ethan looked up, his expression hardening. "She left me because she thought I had nothing. She thought she was walking into something better." He exhaled slowly, the sting of betrayal settling into something colder, sharper. She's about to find out just how wrong she was. Rachel walked out of Ethan's life with her head high, convinced she had made the right decision. She had spent years working tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, pushing herself beyond her limits to earn the title of Dr. Rachel Carter. Now she was free. Free from struggle, free from the past, free to step into the life she deserved. She expected doors to open effortlessly. She had imagined top hospitals competing for her, offering her lucrative positions with benefits that matched her talent. She pictured herself walking into a state-of-the-art medical facility, her new colleagues greeting her with admiration, her supervisors immediately recognizing her potential. She had no doubt that within a few years she would be on the fast track to prestige and success. But reality was unforgiving. The first rejection came faster than she expected, a curt email from a prestigious hospital she had dreamed of working at. "We appreciate your application, but at this time we have chosen to move forward with other candidates." It stung, but she brushed it off. Maybe they were just overwhelmed with applicants. She moved on to the next. And the next. Weeks passed. Every top hospital she applied to turned her down. Some didn't even bother responding. She told herself it was a fluke, bad timing, an overly competitive market. But deep down, panic started creeping in. She had built her entire identity around the idea that she was special, destined for greatness. Yet here she was, checking her email every morning with a pit in her stomach, dreading the inevitable rejection. The offers she had been so certain of never came. Her savings began to dwindle faster than she anticipated. The apartment she had moved into, a sleek modern space meant to reflect her new life, suddenly felt suffocating. Bills piled up. Rent was due. Her carefully curated image of success was beginning to crack. Then, one night, while scrolling through job postings in desperation, she saw it. A new hospital was hiring. Competitive pay. State-of-the-art facilities. A rapidly growing institution looking for promising young doctors to join their team. The job listing practically called to her. Rachel straightened in her chair, her heartbeat picking up. This was it. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She scanned through the details, barely taking the time to read them before clicking apply. She had no idea that the hospital she was begging for a job at was the one Ethan owned. Derek leaned back in Ethan's office chair, scrolling through the stack of digital applications on the hospital's hiring portal, barely paying attention. Most were the usual, fresh graduates looking for their first real position, a few experienced doctors testing the waters for something new. He was about to move on when a name caught his eye. His eyebrows shot up, and for a moment he just stared at the screen before letting out a low whistle. "Oh man," he muttered, shaking his head. Then he burst out laughing. Ethan, who had been reviewing a contract across the desk, looked up with a frown. "What?" Derek turned the screen toward him, still grinning. "Guess who just applied for a job here?" Ethan's gaze dropped to the name. His expression didn't change, but Derek caught the slight twitch in his jaw. There it was. Rachel Carter. The woman who had walked away from him without a second thought. The woman who had told him he wasn't good enough, that she needed someone who matched her status. And now she was unknowingly asking him for a job. Derek shook his head in disbelief. "You can't make this stuff up, man. She really thinks she's just gonna waltz in here like nothing happened? Like she didn't?" Ethan held up a hand, cutting him off. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Derek smirked. "So what's the plan, boss? Gonna let her come in all confident, thinking she's about to land the job of her dreams? Let her sweat it out before you drop the hammer?" Ethan didn't respond right away. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk. There was no anger in his face, just something colder, sharper. "Schedule the interview," he finally said, his voice calm, controlled. Derek let out another chuckle. "Damn, this is gonna be good." Rachel smoothed down the front of her blazer, taking a deep breath before stepping into the hospital's sleek, glass-walled lobby. The place was impressive, modern, bustling. Everything she had envisioned for her future. This was where she belonged, she told herself. After weeks of rejections, weeks of feeling like she was slipping into nothingness, she was finally about to reclaim the life she deserved. She squared her shoulders, reminding herself that she was Dr. Rachel Carter, a woman meant for success. The receptionist smiled and gestured toward a hallway. "Dr. Carter, you can head straight in. The director is expecting you." The director? Rachel hadn't caught the name on the interview confirmation email, but she hadn't cared. The hospital was new but growing fast, and she had assumed it was just another ambitious executive looking to make a name for themselves. She nodded, walked forward with confidence, and stepped into the office. And then she froze. Ethan was sitting behind the desk. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment her mind refused to process what she was seeing. He looked different, more composed, more in control than she had ever seen him. Gone was the exhausted man she had left behind, the man who had once worked himself to the bone for her. In his place sat someone who radiated quiet authority, a man who belonged in the leather chair he was sitting in. Her stomach twisted violently. "Ethan?" she choked out, barely above a whisper. He didn't move, didn't react. He just watched her, his face unreadable, like he was seeing through her. A long, suffocating silence stretched between them before he finally leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "Dr. Carter," he said smoothly, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "please, have a seat." Rachel felt her knees go weak. Her carefully rehearsed introduction, her confident smile, all of it vanished. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Slowly she sank into the chair, gripping the arms as if they were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. She forced herself to breathe, to speak, to fix this before it spiraled even further out of her control. "Ian," she started, her voice shaking. She swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "I made a mistake." A slow exhale, a tilt of the head. Ethan studied her, his expression as impassive as if she were just another applicant. "Did you?" She nodded frantically. "Yes, I didn't see things clearly back then. I was under so much pressure, I thought I needed—" Ethan raised a hand, silencing her. "Someone who matched your status?" His voice was calm, but the weight behind the words made her flinch. She felt the first prickle of tears behind her eyes. "Ethan, please." He didn't move, didn't blink. "Some mistakes," he said quietly, "can't be undone." Rachel's fingers curled into the fabric of her blazer as she forced herself to hold Ethan's gaze. She had never seen him like this before. So calm, so completely unaffected by her presence. The Ethan she had known would have been flustered, nervous, eager to please. This man in front of her? He didn't even look like he cared. Her throat tightened. "Ethan, please." She tried again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong, but I just need a chance to—" "You need a job," Ethan corrected, his voice cool. "That's what this is about." Rachel shook her head quickly. "No, it's not just that. I miss you. I miss us." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He tapped his fingers against the desk, watching her with a patience that made her squirm. "You miss me," he echoed. "Funny. You didn't seem to miss me when you walked away that night. You didn't hesitate when you told me I wasn't enough for you." Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. He was right. She had said those things. She had been so certain back then, so convinced she was stepping into something better. Now, sitting in front of him, stripped of the confidence she once carried, she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. "Tell me, Rachel," he said, "would you have applied here if you had known I owned this hospital?" She froze. The answer was obvious, and the fact that he asked meant he already knew it. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. He leaned back again, exhaling slowly. "I'm not going to hire you," he said, his tone final. Rachel's heart dropped to her stomach. "Ethan, please, just—" "No." The word was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You don't deserve this job, and I don't owe you anything." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'll work harder than anyone," she whispered. "I swear. Ethan stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Good luck, Rachel," he said simply. Rachel sat there for a moment stunned before slowly pushing herself up. Her legs felt unsteady as she turned toward the door. She wanted to say something, anything to make him change his mind, to make him see her, but it was useless. The moment she walked out of this office, she knew. She had lost everything. Ethan had just finished a late-night meeting when he heard the knock at his door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but when he didn't answer right away, it came again, firmer, more desperate. He knew who it was before he even looked. Rachel stood on his doorstep, her once polished appearance replaced with something hollow and worn. Her hair was slightly unkempt, her makeup minimal, dark circles visible under her eyes. The confidence she used to carry like a weapon was gone. She looked smaller somehow, like a woman who had been forced to face the reality she had spent so long denying. He didn't speak, didn't invite her in. He simply leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. She swallowed hard. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice unsteady. He raised an eyebrow. "Rachel." She shifted on her feet, gripping the sleeves of her jacket like she needed something to hold on to. I just wanted to talk." Ethan exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "About what?" Rachel's lips trembled slightly. "About us." A bitter chuckle escaped him before he could stop it. "Us?" he repeated. "Rachel, there hasn't been an us since the night you walked away." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I made a mistake." Ethan studied her, unmoving. "Yeah," he said finally, "you did." She took a step closer, desperate now. "I thought I wanted more, but the truth is, I already had everything. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." Ethan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "No, Rachel, you don't miss me. You miss what you lost." She flinched like he had struck her. His voice remained calm, but his words cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "You didn't leave because I wasn't enough," he said, his tone unwavering. "You left because you thought you could do better." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Ethan, please." His jaw tightened. "Now you have nothing," he said coldly, "and I have everything you wanted." Rachel let out a shaky breath, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had spent years chasing something she thought would make her happy, only to realize too late that she had thrown away the one person who had truly loved her. And now, there was nothing she could say to fix it. Ethan pushed off the doorframe. "Goodbye, Rachel." She opened her mouth, searching for one last plea, one last chance to make him stay, but there was nothing left to say. Without another word, Ethan stepped back inside and closed the door. Rachel stood frozen, staring at the door that had just closed in her face. The finality of it sent a sharp ache through her chest, heavier than she had ever imagined. The man who had once sacrificed everything for her, the man she had so easily cast aside, had just walked away without a second thought. And now, for the first time, she was the one left standing in the silence. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind raced, trying to grasp onto something, anything that could undo this, but there was nothing. No words, no explanations, no justifications that could make him open that door again. She had destroyed everything. Her legs felt unsteady as she turned away from his house, the weight of reality pressing down on her like an unbearable force. Just months ago, she had walked away from Ethan thinking she was stepping into a better life. She had convinced herself that she deserved more, that she was meant for something greater than a life built on sacrifice and struggle. But now she had nothing. No prestigious job, no grand future, no love. She thought back to the night she left him, sitting across from him at that restaurant, thinking she had the world at her feet. She had looked at Ethan like he was beneath her, like he was something she had outgrown. And yet here she was, jobless, alone, and standing outside the home of the only person who had ever truly cared about her, begging for a second chance that would never come. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she wiped at the tears that had begun to fall. She had never felt regret like this before, never understood what it meant to lose something real. And now she would have to live with it. With one last glance at the closed door, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the very emptiness she had chosen. Ethan barely thought about Rachel after that night, not because he was trying to push her out of his mind, but because he was too busy building something far greater than she had ever imagined. The hospital he had originally bought for her became the foundation of something much bigger. What started as a single facility quickly expanded into a growing medical network, attracting top doctors and investors who saw the vision he was creating. His name, once tied to struggle, once whispered in the context of sacrifice, was now spoken with respect in the business world. He no longer worked himself to the bone, no longer came home covered in sweat and exhaustion. Now he was the one making decisions, the one sitting in meetings with industry leaders, the one controlling his own future. He traveled, met people who valued him for his ambition and intelligence, not for what he could provide. He ate at restaurants he once thought were out of his league, wore suits tailored to fit a man who had built something from nothing. And Rachel? She became nothing more than a distant memory, a footnote in his story. A cautionary tale of someone who had everything and let it slip through her fingers. He never looked her up, never checked to see what had become of her. But life had a way of making sure he got the answers anyway. One night, Ethan and Derek sat on the rooftop bar of a high-end hotel, the city lights stretching out before them. The success tasted better than anything he had ever known, not because it was about revenge, but because it was his. He had earned this. He had built this. And he had done it without her. Derek smirked as he swirled the whiskey in his glass. "You know," he said, tilting his head toward Ethan, "I ran into someone the other day." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. He already had a feeling where this was going. Derek let out a chuckle. "Rachel." Ethan didn't react, just took a slow sip of his drink, waiting for Derek to continue. "She looked rough, man. Like, really rough. I almost didn't recognize her," Derek said, shaking his head. "Guess life didn't turn out the way she thought it would." Ethan exhaled, setting his glass down. He wasn't surprised. He had known, even on the night she left him, that she wasn't walking into the future she imagined. The world didn't just hand out success. She had underestimated what it meant to earn something. Derek smirked, raising his glass in a mock toast. She really thought she was upgrading. Ethan finally let out a short laugh, not out of spite, but because of how inevitable it all had been. He clinked his glass against Derek's. "Guess she figured out the hard way." Ethan stared out over the city skyline, the hum of distant traffic blending with the soft clinking of glasses and murmured conversations around him. The air was crisp, the kind of night that once would have made him wish for a warm bed and Rachel's presence beside him. But that version of him was long gone, buried beneath years of sacrifice, betrayal, and, ultimately, growth. He had thought that when this moment came, when he truly moved on, he would feel some kind of lingering bitterness, some last trace of resentment for what she had done. But there was nothing. No anger, no pain, just a quiet, steady peace that settled in his chest like a weight finally lifted. Rachel had been a lesson, not a loss. She had taught him what love shouldn't be, what loyalty really meant, and more importantly, what he deserved. There was a time when he had believed that love meant sacrifice, that giving everything he had to someone else was what made a relationship strong. Now he knew better. Love wasn't just about devotion, it was about respect, about knowing your worth. Derek took another sip of his drink, watching Ethan carefully. "You good?" he asked. Ethan smiled slightly, nodding. "Yeah," he said, meaning it, "I really am." Derek grinned. "Hell of a ride, though." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, but I wouldn't change a thing." He leaned back, taking in the view, feeling something he hadn't in years. True freedom. He had spent so long thinking that Rachel was the best thing in his life, that without her he would always feel like something was missing. But now, standing here, knowing exactly what he had built, what he had become, he realized something. Sometimes losing someone is the best way to find yourself. Ethan never heard from Rachel again after that night. No more desperate texts, no more pleading phone calls, no more attempts to fix what could never be repaired. She had walked away from him when she thought he had nothing, and by the time she realized what she had lost, it was too late. Some people only learn through consequences, and Rachel had learned the hard way. But by then, Ethan had already moved forward, building a life so far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Now, looking back, he didn't regret a thing. He didn't regret the sacrifices, the long nights, the exhaustion, or even the pain of losing her, because every moment of hardship had shaped him into the man he was now, successful, confident, completely in control of his own destiny. He had given his all to someone who never truly valued it, but instead of letting that destroy him, he had used it as fuel to create something greater. And that was the best revenge of all. But what do you think? If you were in Ethan's position, would you have forgiven Rachel? Would you have given her a second chance, knowing everything she had done? Or was he right to walk away, to let her face the consequences of her own choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you would have done. Because the truth is, we've all had a Rachel in our lives at some point. Maybe not a romantic partner, but a friend, a family member, someone who took our loyalty for granted. Someone who only stayed when it was convenient, only valued us when we were useful, and when the moment came where they thought they could do better, they left, believing we would always be there, waiting, just in case. Oh, but that's not love, that's not respect, that's not the kind of relationship anyone deserves. Love should never be one-sided. It should never be about using someone until they're no longer needed. And if someone can walk away from you so easily, if they can discard you without hesitation after everything you've done for them, let them. Don't chase them. Don't beg. Don't waste your time trying to convince someone of your worth when they were too blind to see it in the first place. Because the best revenge isn't anger. It's not trying to hurt them back. It's not even making them regret losing you. The best revenge is success. It's leveling up so far beyond what they expected that by the time they realize what they lost, they can't even reach you anymore. Ethan didn't destroy Rachel. He didn't need to. She destroyed herself the moment she thought she could replace him. He simply let her go and built a life without her. So if you've ever been in Ethan's shoes, remember this. Sometimes losing someone is the best way to find yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a situation where someone underestimated your worth, let this be a reminder. Your value is not determined by how much you sacrifice for someone who doesn't appreciate it. Sometimes walking away isn't losing, it's winning. It's reclaiming your power, your dignity, and your future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories of resilience, courage, and transformation to those who need to hear them. And remember, real success isn't about proving anything to the people who doubted you. It's about building a life so fulfilling that their absence doesn't even matter. So tell me, have you ever had a moment where walking away turned out to be the best decision of your life? Share your story in the comments. Let's create a space where we lift each other up, remind each other of our worth, and never settle for less than we deserve. Together, we can build a world where dignity, respect, and self-worth always come first.